My name is Lawrence Lessig, and I'm a professor of law at Harvard Law School. Well, I guess there's nothing surprising about people trying to find a way to influence government. And as libertarians always say, the more government does, the more people will try to find ways to influence government. And some of the strongest libertarians at the founding were not libertarian from some philosophical perspective, but more from a practical perspective. Big government is corrupt government, so therefore we should have small government. Now, I think the thing that is missed sometimes in the comparison to Federalist 10, where Madison talks about factions canceling each other out, is that in some sense it's a clumsy election process. The framers were proud of the fact that they achieved a 2-year election cycle for the House that would keep the House close to the people. But just because 2 years is better than 4 years, it doesn't follow that 1 year is better than 2 years, or that 1 month is better than 2 years, or that 1 day is better than 2 years. And what's interesting about the money game is that you now can begin to see the way in which we've produced a system with 2 kinds of elections. There's the money election and the vote election. And the vote election is highly regulated. Nobody can have more power than anybody else in the vote election. The Supreme Court will strike down any apportionment statute that gives any side more than equal amount of vote. So equality is the norm in the vote election, and it's very heavily enforced. But in the money election, an election that happens every single day, where every single day members of Congress are raising money and trying to attract more money to their side, they're constantly being responsive to, again, the tiny slice of America that's funding. So there's more responsiveness, but it's not responsiveness to everybody. It's responsiveness to a tiny slice of America. So Federalist 10, is talking about this world where the factions have to get together, but the way they exercise their power is through elections every 2 years and every 6 years in the context of the senators who are chosen by the state legislatures at the time of the founding. But now we have factions that manifest themselves every day, appear one day and drive money in their direction, and so the way in which factions operate in this system is just radically much more difficult to control. And so I think one thing to do is just to turn down the faction pressure, which would come by removing the way in which money corrupts the process in this system. Yeah, the Supreme Court's getting the wrong answer here, not because it's corrupt. It's getting the wrong answer because it just hasn't worked through, conceptually, the relationship between protection of free speech and protection of the democracy. And it has, as I said, a very narrow conception of the intersection between those two, which is in the field of corruption. So it's okay with restricting free speech when corruption is on the table, but when corruption is not on the table, we can't restrict free speech. But it doesn't understand what corruption means. So I think that the court's got to begin to think more about what a well-functioning election system looks like. And there are lots of examples for it to draw on. The Supreme Court, if you go make an argument in the Supreme Court gives both sides equal time. And they limit the number of briefs that they will consider. They tell you how many pages can be in your brief. And if you're a friend of the court and you want to file a brief, you need permission of the court. And the court will only take so many. So in the context of the court making its own decisions about which side in a case to choose, it has an extraordinary amount of regulation of speech that it builds into the system. Now, I don't think it thinks of itself as violating the First Amendment because it understands that regulation is necessary to make it possible to have a rational judgment about which side should prevail. And I think that just that same kind of understanding needs to be applied a little bit more to the process that we now see elections going through. Nobody can look at the system that we have right now and think that it's producing rational judgments by anybody. And it can't be that the Constitution binds us to an irrational democracy. It must be that we're allowed under the Constitution to structure elections in a way that could begin to elicit once again something other than the crudest, crassest, most polarized kind of political debate driven by endless drive for money. Yeah, so there is a personal dimension to this, which is I've been obsessed for 40 years, literally 38 years, with the way in which institutions become corrupted in a certain sense. And by that I mean, what we sometimes talk about as good Germans inside of an institution. People who are not willing to do what objectively is not a hard thing to do in order to avoid substantial harm by of others. So, my own personal experience included being inside of an institution where there was extensive sex abuse when I was a child. That was enabled by people not willing to pick up a telephone and report what they knew was going on. So that structure of corruption, that structure of malfeasance has been at the center of what I think of when I think of justice from the very beginning of my thinking about these issues. And so it couldn't help but kind of see the same dynamic in the context of the way the current corruption of this political system functions. Because once again, you have people, you have the evil people, like the abuser, you have the Blagojevich, like you have the sex abuser, and those are bad people, no doubt, and they should be criminally prosecuted and punished. But they are enabled by the next circle of people around them, people who don't stop them, don't pick up a phone, don't think about how to change the system to avoid this kind of opportunity or dynamic. And so in my head, these are exactly the same kind of problem. So I can't help but when I think about it, feel it very personally, very directly. And also believe, we're at a stage of, I'm not writing for legal academics. I'm not writing for the political science crowd. I'm really writing, I hope, for citizens. And I think I find that people connect and understand better at a personal level than they do at a theoretical level. So that's certainly part of what might make this successful. I am hopeful because people get it. I had to write a long book to kind of get people, to talk about what I think people get, but people get it. They get that sense of this corruption. They don't have much a sense of what we could do about it, but I think we can show them what we can do about it. And I think that we're beginning to see the revival of a kind of outsider, grassroots citizen movement that can actually achieve its effect. So, Hobbes writes about the sleeping giant, the sovereign, and sometimes he wakes up, and most of the times when he wakes up, he does a lot of damage. But that's the only potential that we have. It's to wake the sovereign up, to get it to recognize it has a left hand and a right hand. It needs to learn to walk and speak. But if it can do that, it actually ultimately has the power over others inside the system.